just always going to give a little pause at the beginning to make sure that we're not just sending out the live stream, but that it's also being captured and transmitted on both Facebook and YouTube. So let's give that just a moment. Okay, looks like it's happening. Fantastic. Okay. Beautiful. All right, who's with us? Who's in the house? Where are you tuning in from? It's a beautiful Sunday late afternoon here in Los Angeles. James Roth in the house from Indianapolis. Stephen Giguere from Dover, New Hampshire. I've got a new microphone. Let me know if it's coming through nice and clear. I'm hoping for some nice, crisp clarity. Let me know if it is so. Sharon Frant Brooks says Erev Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Deborah Hazelwood from Florida. Melissa Itel-Jurin, great to see you from Great Neck. Ed Berg from Galloway, New Jersey, always good to see you. Chuck Wright in the house from Frederick, Maryland. Janice Beanstalk. Tom Beck says Shavua Tov, everyone. Joey Takikawa Curry from Santa Ana, California. And Chuck Wright says loud and clear. Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate the feedback. Louis Rago from Las Vegas, Nevada. James Roth gives a thumbs up. I assume it's for the sound clarity. Beautiful. David Gary from Lee's Summit, Missouri. And Nina's in the house, literally in the house. I'm out in the office, and she'll be monitoring comments as we go along. All right, we've got an exciting DAF today. Big DAF, big DAF. Sometimes we just continue our discussion of a Mishnah, doing the Gemaras on the Mishnah for an entire DAF. Sometimes we have two Mishnahs in the course of one DAF. We've had three Mishnahs in the course of one DAF. So a Mishnah, a teaching from that earlier period of the Tanaim, the earlier sages, and the Gemaras are the commentaries on that. So we've had maybe three Mishnahs in one DAF. Today we got 5 Mishnahs in one DAF. That means that the Gemaras are quite short. I'm not even going to attempt to do all 5. We're going to focus on continuing our discussion of the first Mishnah, and then we're going to do 4 more, or 3 more, and then the fourth we're going to leave until tomorrow. So we'll finish our discussion today a little bit before the end of today's DAF. And what is today's DAF? Wow, another milestone. This is DAF Kuf, means 100. We are on page 100 of Masechet Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud, Shabbos. We are on page 100. We're in chapter 10, and today we're going to be finishing our discussion of Mishnah number 2, and we're going to do Mishnahs numbers 3, 4, and 5. But we're going to save our discussion of Mishnah 6 until tomorrow. So let's get into it. And you'll be happy to know, by the way, that we're coming to the end. We're approaching the end of our lengthy discussion, and we've gone in and out of it. But really, since the beginning of this tractate, we've been talking primarily about carrying, about transferring an object from the private domain to the public domain, or the public domain to the private domain. And there's been so much to say on this subject, and we keep coming back to it. But in another 2 pages, we're going to start to talk about some of the other prohibited labors of Shabbos in some depth. And it occurred to me when I was preparing, to do this class tonight, you might have thought, right, that the discussion in the Talmud about Shabbos, right, this is tractate Shabbos, would have been so much more about the inner meaning, the spiritual meaning, the soul's repose, right? We enter the Shabbos period, Friday evening comes and we cease all work. Okay, we get it. And then what is it that we do on Shabbos, right? We've been talking so much about what we don't do on Shabbos. What is it that we do? And that hasn't been so much the discussion of our sages, although we've gone in and out of it at times, especially when we've done some of the sort of higher, more story-based and esoteric teachings. What happened in heaven when Moses was receiving the Torah, the fact that the Torah was received on Shabbos. God appeared to the children of Israel in the desert on Shabbos. And that Shabbos is this reset every week that we have it. And it's the original holiday when God rested after 6 days of creation. But the fact that we focus so much in the Talmud and in this tractate on the physicality of Shabbos, what we do and what we don't do, particularly what we don't do, but also what we do in light of the fact that there are restrictions and prohibitions, so we prepare, right? Because we can't do these things on Shabbos, Friday becomes so much more important so that we can get into that frame of mind. And this is so very much a part of Judaism. There's tremendous, a vast ocean of teachings about the inner meanings of things. And if you're with me, you're going to hear a lot about the inner meanings of things. The Kabbalah, the mystical aspects, just the more spiritual aspects. Certainly when we were talking in the first tractate, Brachos, about how and when we pray, we got into that inner meaning and that inner relationship with God and the soul's journey. And you'll keep hearing more about that. But Judaism is also very much about practice, about things that we do, practical things. And this is why our sages are going to take so much time to define the limits and the requirements of those activities, because we believe very much that the way to be a holy person in this world is not to retreat into some cave and never leave. Now, what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did that for 12 years, and he returned with the Zohar. But that's just one example of the many hundreds of sages that we learn from. And it really is not, it never has been, never will be an ascetic religion, which is all about removing ourselves from the world. The whole idea of Judaism is that we practice and seek holiness in the world, in our daily activities. And there is a holy way and an inner meaning to do everything that we do in our lives, in our daily lives, in the world. And that is how we transform this physical world into a home for the divine presence. And indeed, that's why we're here. That is our mission. Okay. Let us start. Okay, today what we're talking about, all right, so we've been discussing carrying for a long time, carrying something from the private domain to the public domain and back from the public domain to the private domain. And we've understood that there's three elements to any kind of carrying. You got to pick something up, carry it, and put it down. There needs to be some sort of taking from a place and putting in a place. And those elements have to be there in some form for one to become liable for the violation of Shabbos. Today we're going to talk a little bit, well, what happens if when you take an object or when you place an object, the place that you take from or the place that you put in, you put the object that you set the object to is not stable, right? What if it's not clear where the object is being put? That's the question we're dealing with today. Rava said that taking water from water or pouring water on water is placing, right? So we talked yesterday that if there's a well in the public domain and there's no private domain around the well, and the well is more than 10 handbreadths deep, so that well, the area of the well where the water is, as long as it's more than 4 handbreadths wide, it is a private domain that is separate from the public domain. So if you reached in, let's say with a ladle, and you took water out and you brought it into the public domain where you're standing, so you would have violated Shabbos. You'd be liable for violating Shabbos. And that's why we might make a fence around the well so that there's a place that's where you can stand next to the well, and you'd be in an enclosure, and that would be a private domain. And then you could take the water out and drink it, because you would have been taking water from water, transferring it from a private domain to a private domain rather than a public domain, and then you'd be exempt. You wouldn't have violated Shabbos. So as part of that learning, now we see that when we take water from water, right, we took water from water. We took some water from a gathering of water, and so that's considered taking, right? We took water from a place. If we poured water into water, right, if we took the water out of the well, let's say, and then there was another container of water that we were, somebody was filling water, let's say, in a container, and so we took it out of the well and put it in this container outside, that would be a violation of Shabbos if that container was in the public domain, even if the water that was taken from the well was landing on water that was already in that container. So water landing on water, or water being taken from water, constitutes a valid taking or placing. Okay. But now we have the question of, what about a nut, right? So Rav is telling us that water from water, or water onto water, yes, that constitutes one of those, two of those elements of carrying, right? The taking or the placing. But if there's a nut floating on some water, imagine a peanut is floating on some water in a well, and you pick up the peanut and you take it from the well, and then now you're holding it in the public domain. And let's say that this nut is large enough to be considered a minimum measure. Did you carry? Right? Was the taking from the surface of the water of that nut a legitimate taking that constitutes this element that we need in order to become liable for violating Shabbos? Answer, no. No, it's not. And in fact, because the nut floating on the water was never at rest, right? It's in motion. A peanut floating on water, even if the water is very still, that peanut's going to move around a little bit. And if there's any kind of a breeze, if there's any kind of a current on the body of water, river, ocean, whatever, for sure that peanut's going to be moving around. And because it's moving around, it's considered that it was never at rest. And so if you took the peanut from the surface of the water, or you placed it onto the surface of the water, and that was part of the taking or placing at the beginning or at the end of a transfer from one domain to another, you'd be exempt, because you didn't really transfer from one domain to another. If you picked it up in the public domain and then placed it on water in the private domain, you didn't place it. It's still in motion. It's like the act of carrying hasn't come to an end if you place it on water. So Rava teaches us that that person is exempt. Now we get very Talmudic, another variation on this question that really challenges our understanding. Okay, if we took water from water, that's considered taking. And it kind of makes sense, because the water is one thing, and we took water from the water, or we added water to water, and so it became one thing. The nut is not going to be one thing with the water. Now, the new case is, imagine a bowl that floats on top of the surface of the water, and the interior of this bowl, this vessel, is dry, right? So, I don't know, imagine this bell, right? It's hollow. This doesn't float, but imagine a wooden bowl, right, like this, and it floats. So it's on top of the surface of the water. Now you take your peanut and put it in the bowl. Or the peanut was already in the bowl, and you take it from the bowl. Was that a legit act of taking if you took the peanut from the bowl, or placing if you put the peanut into the bowl? Because certainly if the bowl is on the ground and you put the peanut in the bowl, yeah, that is placing, right? The peanut has come to rest on a bowl that is at rest, right? But now that the bowl is floating on the water, do we follow the peanut with respect to the bowl, the peanut is at rest in the bowl, but the bowl itself is moving on the surface of the water. So do we follow the peanut's location with respect to the bowl, or the peanut's location with respect to the water underneath it, and the peanut and the bowl are one thing? We might recall that when we were talking about carrying out of the house, that even if we had a big, heavy bowl, but the only thing that was in it was a little bit of food that was smaller than the minimum measure for which one would be liable for carrying on Shabbos, the bowl is subservient to the food that's in it. It's a vessel for the food. So if the bowl was empty, okay, well then it's a vessel and it's this heavy thing that you're moving outside, and so you'd be liable for carrying. But if you're just using the bowl to carry this little scrap of food that's less than the minimum measure, so you'd be exempt because the bowl follows the food. So here in this case with the nut, you might say, well, the bowl is subservient to the nut, and therefore the nut is moving around on the water, so maybe it seems like you'd be exempt. The sages ultimately don't give an answer on this question. Teku, they let the question stand. Because they didn't resolve the question, later sages will say, if this ever comes up in the real world, we have to be lenient, right? Because the sages didn't give a ruling, we're not going to come in later and give a ruling that is more stringent than where they let it be. So if there's a bowl that's floating on a pool and you take a nut from it and then walk out into the public domain, you're exempt because you didn't take it from anywhere. It was in motion when you plucked it out of the air, so to speak. And this also teaches us something interesting that is very much worth keeping in mind. And let me say at this point, today I had a long drive this morning. I had something to do about an hour away from LA. And so on the way out, because I knew I wanted to be ready to teach this class, but I wasn't going to be able to do it the way I normally do, is just sit there and read the DAF. So I listened to the DAF, and I listened to it being taught on an app called DAF, which is put out by the Orthodox Union. And they have several teachers on there who teach the DAF. And so I actually, on my way out there, I heard this page taught by Rabbi Moshe Elephant. And on the way back, I heard the same DAF taught by Rabbi Shalom Rosner. And I was immediately reminded of the first time I did DAF Yomi when I started in 2005. And I just had, so little background, so little training, never went to yeshiva. My Hebrew was so weak. And I tried to go to a shiur, like me teaching you, but with a rabbi who's been teaching it for decades, to people, like the rabbi went to yeshiva for many years, and his students went to yeshiva for many years. So when you hear a shiur taught in that context, and that's like these rabbis teach it on the OU's app, DAF, so they just assume so much knowledge in their listeners that they use a lot of jargon, right? I mean, I would say more than half of the words that come from the rabbi's mouth are in Hebrew or Aramaic, phrases that come up over and over again. It gave me a little bit of pleasure that now at this point in my learning, I still miss some of the words. I don't know everything that they're saying. I don't know the meaning of every word they say. But of course I can follow along because, this is my third time through this material that we're doing now. But it made me think that I don't have their expertise. I don't have their background. I can't answer every question that they would be able to answer. But a lot of the people, and I would put myself in that group, certainly earlier in my learning, just can't learn from them. If you don't have that background, you just won't know what they're talking about. And so it made me feel, very grateful to have this opportunity to teach and to share these pages with you and to share the Talmud with you, because my goal is to make it accessible to everyone. I don't dumb it down. God knows this stuff is very challenging. It just can't really be dumbed down. But I do want to make it accessible to everybody, and that's why I translate every word that I use and explain every concept as I go along. Still, it was pretty thrilling to hear it from those guys it really is not for everybody. That's for somebody who's already been studying many years. But their knowledge is just so great, and it was fun to pick up a few things that I'll share today from them. Okay, so the sages let that sit about pulling the nut from the plate that's sitting on the water. But something that Rabbi Rosner was bringing up repeatedly in his shiur today is that we have to note that principles that apply in the laws of Shabbos don't necessarily apply in other bodies of law. And then we're talking about Jewish law here. So, for example, the idea that you could take from a vessel that is on the water, right? In this case, we're talking about a wooden bowl, but it could just as easily be a wooden raft. It could even be a boat, okay? And we're saying that because the boat or the vessel that's on the water, usually when I say vessel, I mean a bowl, right? Something that's used to carry food around or to contain something else, especially the vessels in the Holy Temple, but even in a kitchen, vessels that hold things. But of course, it is the same word in English for a boat, right? And there's going to be discussion of boats quite a bit more tomorrow, a little bit today. But this idea that if we take the nut from a vessel that's on a surface of water, it's not considered taking or placing because the vessel is in motion. That only applies to the laws of Shabbos. When we're talking about a kinyan, so a kinyan is acquisition, right? If I sell you something, right? If I sell you a horse, if I sell you a field, if I sell you a house, if I sell you a car today, in the contract law of Judaism, and the Talmud is the extensive body of laws about contracts and purchases and ownership and rental and borrowing and agency, etc. But when there's a purchase and sale, there needs to be an act of kinyan, right? These days, what we basically do is we sign a contract. But in the days of the Talmud, in ancient times, they would actually do a physical act that would represent acquisition. And there are certain things that would happen, and sometimes, the act of acquisition would happen. It wasn't even intended, but it would have happened, and there would be a transfer of ownership. So kinyan is an act of acquisition. And we're not going to go into this whole case now, but this idea that you could be on a boat and a fish could jump into your boat, right? And now the question is, does that fish belong to you? Right? The fish jumped into your boat. Now it's in your boat. If we're saying that placing or taking from a vessel that's floating on water vis-a-vis the laws of Shabbos is not taking or placing, one would be exempt, right, for taking that nut and then going out to the public domain because he never took it from a place at rest, never took it from the ground, never took it from a table, only took it from a thing in motion. That's for the laws of Shabbos. But for the laws of acquisition and ownership, it does count. If that fish jumps into your boat, it does become your fish and you can take it home and eat it, clean it and cook it and eat it. So it's just one, that's just one example, and there's many examples. And we've come up a bunch of times, even in our studies so far, that we saw that laws that apply with respect to Tuma and Tahara, ritual impurity and ritual purity, don't necessarily have the same principles, the same limitations, the same leniencies as the laws of Shabbos. And we're constantly comparing and contrasting how definitions and limits and boundaries in one field of law, in this case the laws of Shabbos, are different than other fields of law like acquisition and ownership, like ritual purity, like divorce contracts, etc. There's going to be just many, many different bodies of law, and they're going to have different definitions that don't necessarily apply in other cases. But we can learn from those differences, and that's why we make these comparisons and contrasts. Okay. Now we have the case brought by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and he discusses oil that is floating on wine. So we know that oil floats. Oil is going to float on wine. Oil is going to float on water. In this case, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is talking about oil floating on wine rather than water, because both oil and wine can become subject to teruma. A portion of it can be set aside and given as a tithe to the Kohen. And teruma must remain in a state of tahara, of ritual purity, in order for the Kohanim, the priests, to be able to consume them. And that's why we're talking about oil and wine. Now, if oil is floating on wine, and in Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's case, it is touched by a tevul yom. A tevul yom is somebody who contracted ritual impurity in some way. Let's say that he touched a creeping thing, a sheretz, and then he immersed in a mikvah. So he immersed in the living waters of a mikvah, which is going to purify him. Now, he's not going to be pure and able to eat teruma, to eat of the holy, that's only for the priests, and which is in a state of purity. That food has to be in a state of purity. But he can't eat it until his purification process is complete. When is it complete? At nightfall. When was the first time we learned about this? On the first day of our DAF Yomi journey. From what time may we say the evening Shema? From the time that the priests, who are Tevul Yom, who have immersed and are waiting for daylight to end so that their purification is complete, right? When you immerse during the day, you don't become pure until nightfall, when the new Hebrew day begins. So, a Tevul Yom, why is Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri specifying the Tevul Yom? Because he has a very minor impurity. He's purified of the major impurity that he had when he touched the creeping thing. Now he's just waiting for nightfall. When he's in that state, if he touches something, it will become impure. But his impurity was so lightweight that the next thing he touches, it will become impure, but it will not be able to transmit impurity further, right? If he had the heavy impurity of just after he touched the creeping thing and he touched something and made it impure, then that thing would have the stronger tuma, and in certain cases it would be able to transmit that impurity to the next thing that it touches. So the Tevul Yom touches the oil that's floating on top of the wine. The oil becomes impure. The wine beneath it does not. And this teaches us that the oil, even though it's a liquid floating on another liquid, it's resting on top, but it has not fused. Even though it's a liquid in a liquid, they have not become one thing. They retain their distinction. And I remember the first time I learned this, it reminded me of two things. One is a great description in Moby Dick of how two rivers can come together, and you see this in the Amazon in Brazil. Two rivers can join into one, and even though it's water, it's fresh water, river water from two different rivers, nevertheless, the rivers are coming from different sources, and one river might have water that's darker than the other. It's just a different color. And for a while, the rivers that have merged, the water will flow along, and it will retain its distinct color from where it came before. So even though these things should have merged, you can still see that they've remained distinct from one another. And there was also the description in the book Moby Dick how they would be slaughtering the whale. It was all about whaling, and they would draw oil, right? Whaling was a big industry at a time when people used whale oil for lamps, right? People who weren't burning olive oil were burning whale oil. I think it was thought to be a higher quality oil. And it was, it was kind of gross, right? Like they would catch this huge whale, bring it alongside the ship, strip off all its blubber, cut it into little pieces, boil it in these huge pots. And, if you've ever seen a cow butchered, okay, so now imagine a whale being butchered alongside a ship. It's just a huge, bloody scene. But occasionally from that huge bloody scene and all the smells that are associated with it, they would find ambergris in the whale, which was the source of the most expensive perfume in the world. And so amidst all the sights and odors and smells of this massive butchery, this sweet, sweet little current of a beautiful smell would come through and reach the nostrils of the witness, right? In this case, Ishmael, the sailor who's at sea and writing about his journey, the narrator of Moby Dick. Okay. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is teaching us that the oil does not fuse with the wine. It retains its distinctive character. It is separate, right? Unlike taking water from water, here the oil sitting on the wine didn't become one with the wine. And so presumably if you took some oil from the surface of the wine, again, it would be like taking the nut from the water. It wouldn't really be at rest, and it wouldn't be a valid act of taking for the purposes of the laws of Shabbos. Now, we're going to be talking quite a bit more tomorrow about boats and what happens when boats are at sea and if boats are tied together. And in the shir that I heard this morning, Rabbi Moshe Elephant was talking. He brought down this beautiful teaching from a Rebbe, and I can't remember the name of the Rebbe that Rabbi Moshe Elephant was citing. But the concept was, and I'm going to bring it here today, even though we're not yet talking about boats, not really. The idea was that, we're all in boats. We're all on voyages, right? What's your boat? It's your body. You are, as a human, right? You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. So your body is essentially your vessel for sailing through this world, sailing through your lifetime. And the idea is that we're all in these boats, on the ocean at the same time. So if all we do is, see that, hey, there's a lot of boats out there, and hi, wave to the other boats. So, okay, it can be a little bit inspiring that we're not alone. And from time to time, we can visit shipmates, right? We can go visiting people in other boats and get together a little bit. But when we form strong relationships, right? When we tie those boats together, then something else happens. Now, what I'd like to add to this teaching, this is now my thought, we're all floating on what? On an ocean. Right? So we're going through this life and we are vessels floating on this ocean. On one sense, the ocean is what? It's just the physical world that we live in. It's the city that you live in. It's the city that I live in. It's the roads that we drive on. It's the sidewalks we walk on, the workplaces where we check in and do what we do, the Zoom calls that we make during the pandemic. That ocean is just a physical place. But now we're going to talk about a little inner meaning. But if you think about this whole physical universe, right, as being inside a dream that God is dreaming, this whole creation was made by God for a purpose. And every aspect of it is God's creation, right? So now you start to see, well, wait a minute. I'm not just floating on this water. I'm a soul in God's creation, right? I am a creation of God, in a creation of God. Now once you start to see it that way, so now you can become a little bit more like water on water instead of oil on water. When you start to realize that you are a soul and you've been given a physical expression, and that this whole world is like that too, right? This whole world is embodied by the desire of God. This whole world is the desire of God, and it's been given a physical form. You're here because you have a mission. As I always say, you have to ask yourself, what is my mission? What is my mission? What is my mission? The answer is always, my mission is the thing that only I can do. I was sent here for a reason. There's something that only I can do, a help that only I can provide, a mentorship that only I can do, a charity that only I can support. Obviously, other people are going to do similar things, but there's something that we do in particular, that you do, that every individual can only do in particular. And when you realize that you were sent here to provide this service to the world, this particular service that only you can provide, then you start to lose your nature as oil, and to become a little bit more fused, water in water. And you're part of this magnificent mission of the creation, right? And you start to do your part to make this whole magnificent creation a home for God. And when we've all realized our missions, that will be the Messianic age. That's when Mashiach will show up and God's presence will be revealed to all. So you got to sink in and sort of become water in water, but you can't stay there. You can't only be water in water, because then it's like you're becoming somebody who's just so immersed in mysticism that you don't come back out of that analogy, come out of that metaphor and live in this world. So that's why humans are so special. We can handle two ideas at once. We can handle two contradictory ideas at once. We are a soul that is part of a soul creation, right? God's creation. God is the soul that inhabits the whole universe, and we are a piece of that, and the soul that inhabits my body. And I'm a piece of that. But I don't just dwell in that and just, dream and trip on it. I go and have a job and raise children and love my wife and act in the world and try to do and be holy in this world, in the solid matter, in the day-to-day, and the rough and tumble, and the challenges of it. And so one example of what it looks like to have that dual nature, to be a soul in a soul universe and to be living in the solid and the mundane, is when your teenage children act up. Nobody can be as annoying and as hard and as insolent and as irritating as a teenager, okay? So when a teenager acts up, what do we do? Like, it's so easy to take it personally. And if you don't have a teenage child, it's like you have an employee or you have a boss, and it's the most irritating people around. You have to be around them when they're being so irritating. And my friend and mentor, Rabbi Elchanan Tauber here in LA, he says, when you're in that situation, right, you've got to stand back, not take it personally, and see that that person who's annoying you so much is another soul. And you just look at that soul and you go, really? And if you can remember to do that in the midst of your anger and annoyance, wow, will it diffuse the situation in a hurry. It won't always work, but it's amazing how often and how well it will work. Just try to remember that the next time you're really annoyed and see if you can bring that to bear between you and the person who's irritating you. All right, I'm going to move on. Okay, that was our little boat metaphor. Water in water, oil in water. Okay. And just to connect it very quickly to this week's Torah portion, which is Shlach, which is when Moses sent the spies into the Holy Land, right? And like, he didn't really want to do that. God was telling Moses to tell the people, here, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to here, go into there. But God said, if you want for yourself, send some spies into the land to see what it's going to be like, so you can start to plan how you're going to take over when the children of Israel walk into the promised land. And the spies were great men, the leaders of their tribes. And yet they went into the land and they said, that land is amazing. It is beautiful, but it's inhabited by giants and they will eat us alive. We don't have a chance. Why would they say something like that? These people witnessed God splitting the Red Sea, doing 10 plagues, appearing at Mount Sinai. Why in heaven's name would they doubt that God is going to help them go in and conquer the promised land, which he has promised them for 400 years since Abraham? It makes no sense. Why would they act that way? And we have a tradition that it wasn't just so much that they were scared and didn't think that they could make a military conquest of the land. What they were scared of is that they were going to lose this elevated spiritual state that they all had when we were living in the desert, eating manna, right? We have a tradition that when the children of Israel were in the desert eating manna, they didn't even go to the bathroom. It was just like what went into them was exactly what they needed. It tasted beautiful. and it elevated them. It elevated their spirits and their minds. They were learning the Torah for the first time from Moses, who was getting it from God. God's presence was 100% manifest, visible every day. There he is. God has sent this presence to assure us that he's with us, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. They didn't want to leave the cozy cocoon of this beautiful existence in the desert. That's why they didn't want to go enter the land. They wanted to remain water in water. But the time had come to become both a physical being and a spiritual being fused together in the world. And we have to be courageous enough to do that. On Shabbos, we're much more spiritual. On Shabbos, we can form a vision of who we are and what we want to do in the rest of the week. Then the rest of the week comes, and we roll up our sleeves and get to work. Okay. That's what I wanted to say about Mishnah number 2. Now I'm going to cover 3 other Mishnahs that appear on this DAF, and I'm going to cover them quickly so that I can get to your questions. I know this class is running long, but it's a very rich DAF and a rich class we're having today. All right, moving quickly. Mishnah number 3. If you throw an object in the public domain and it hits a wall above 10 handbreadths, so you're exempt. You didn't really throw it. If it hits the wall below 10 handbreadths, you're liable. This is assuming that the object went more than 4 cubits. This is the same idea of placing, right? If it ends up on a wall and over 10 handbreadths, that is not the public domain anymore. This is an exempt area above the public domain. What does it mean that if it hits the wall, over 10 handbreadths, then we're exempt? Isn't it just going to bounce back? And so Rabbi Yochanan says, no. What we're talking about is a sticky cake of figs, that when you throw it at the wall, it sticks to the wall. So if it hits the wall and sticks to the wall and it's higher than 10 handbreadths, okay, so it's like it stayed in the air. We didn't have a valid placing of that. You picked it up, carried it, and put it down. Right? If you're still holding it, by the way, and you walk more than 4 cubits, okay, then you holding it is enough because you can hold it still. That's unlike water. But in this case, where you threw it and it landed higher than 10 handbreadths above the ground, it stuck to the wall, so it's considered that it was not placed anywhere. It's like it's still hanging in mid-air. I guess I'll cover this really quickly. If you toss it into a hole in the wall. So if the hole in the wall happens to be 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, then it would be its own private domain. So in fact, if it was more than 10 handbreadths above the public domain, it's definitely a separate domain. You toss it into that hole, then you're liable. You did violate Shabbos. But if the hole in the wall that you toss your figs into is less than 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, so it's too small, it's an exempt domain, and you're exempt. You didn't violate Shabbos. Rabbi Meir says, well, actually, if the wall is really thick, and even though the hole is smaller than 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, but if the wall is thick enough that you could carve out a hole in that wall, that would be 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths. So then he would hold you liable, even though the hole is too small to be its own private domain. And the rabbis said to Rabbi Meir, very creative, very interesting, but no. They overruled Rabbi Meir. And this will come up again, for example, in the laws of mezuzah, a doorway that is large enough and has the correct dimensions in order to require a mezuzah. In some cases where it's a small doorway with an arch, and because there's an arch, the curves don't fulfill. There are many archways where you absolutely have to put a mezuzah, but there's a certain specific case where this archway is going to be too small and it's not going to have the required dimensions, and so it doesn't require a mezuzah. Rabbi Meir will say, yeah, but if you carved out those corners, it would be large enough. So because you could carve out I would hold you liable, says Rabbi Meir. And the rabbis said to Rabbi Meir, we love you, you're brilliant, we respect you so much. But no, they disagreed with him, and the law is like the rabbis on that imaginative principle of carving out. The rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Meir. Mishnah number 4 of chapter 10. If you intend to throw an object less than 4 cubits in the public domain, and it ends up traveling more than 4 cubits. So the minimum measure to become liable, right, for violating Shabbos is that you carry something 4 cubits in the public domain, or you throw it more than 4 cubits in the public domain. You picked it up, you throw it, it landed, right? And it lands less on a wall or on the ground and less than 10 handbreadths high. So the minimum measure is 4 cubits. You intended to throw it 2 cubits, less than the minimum measure. It ended up going more than 4 cubits. You might think that you'd be liable for violating Shabbos because you threw something more than 4 cubits, but because that was not your intention, you didn't intend to violate Shabbos, and the act that you did was not on purpose. And so in this case, like in American criminal law, you don't have mens rea. You don't have the intent to commit that violation. You would have violated the rabbinic law for sure. You violated the halacha, but you don't become liable to bring the sin offering for violating Shabbos. However, in this Mishnah, we learned the reverse case. If you intended to throw it more than 4 cubits, so your mens rea, your intent was to violate Shabbos. You were going to do an act that would have violated Shabbos. But something happened and the thing rolled back. And in the end, it didn't go more than 4 cubits. It ended up going only, let's say, 2 cubits. Now there's a little bit of a dispute. Let's say, and anyone who's played frisbee or golf on a windy day can imagine sometimes you hit something and the wind blows so hard that the wind just blows it right back, right? So if it held up in the wind, it sort of went past the 4 cubits, but then the wind blew it back, are you liable? One opinion is, well, because at some moment it stopped going forward and then it came back, so it was still for just one moment. So you might think that it was placed beyond the 4 cubits and then it came back, but in fact, you're going to be exempt for that. However, Rabbi Yochanan teaches that if, let's say, it landed in the public domain more than 4 cubits away, and then it bounced off a wall and came back, or the wind blew it back, but for one moment it was on the ground and it went more than the 4 cubits, then you would be liable. Stopping in the airspace is not enough, but if you land for even a moment, or as we saw yesterday, the concept of lavud, if you came within 3 handbreadths of the ground, that's considered like you landed. You're no longer in the airspace, even though maybe you never physically touched the ground. If you came within 3 handbreadths of the ground, that's considered that you landed, and then it came back, you'd be liable. And finally, Mishnah number 5, if you throw something more than 4 cubits and it lands in the sea. Now, the sea is vast. You would think that the sea, the ocean, and the ocean is always such a metaphor for our Talmudic journey, right? The DAF Yomi is a voyage on the sea of Talmud. But now we're talking about the real ocean, the physical ocean. If you throw something on Shabbos into the ocean, did you violate Shabbos? If it lands in the ocean, no. The ocean is not considered a public domain. The ocean is considered a Carmelis, and so is a river. A Carmelis, recall, is neither private domain nor public domain. Why is the ocean, which is so vast, not considered the public domain? Perhaps because we don't see the walls, right? We don't see the sides of the ocean. We can't see the side of the ocean. We don't see the bottom of the ocean. It's too vast. And it's just the legal designation of the ocean is Carmelis. So if you throw something into the ocean, exempt. Prohibited rabbinically, but exempt from bringing the sin offering. However, if a public domain passes through a swamp, interesting, if it passes through a swamp, the rule is going to be different. If you throw something into the swamp, you're going to be liable if the swamp is less than 10 handbreadths deep. If it's less than 10 handbreadths deep, then it's considered part of the public domain. People walk through a swamp. It might not be pleasant. They don't always want to do it, but it happens. People can walk through a swamp. People do walk through a swamp. And so the swamp, as long as it's not more than 10 handbreadths deep, is considered part of the public domain. That is what I've got for us today. Let me check the questions and comments. Sharon Frant Brooks says, but can you open the nut up and eat it? So now we're talking about the Shabbos, the prohibited labor on Shabbos of extracting, right? So my understanding, I could be wrong. You should check to see if I'm right or wrong. But I believe that you can crack a nut open and eat the nut. You can't crack like 20 nuts open and take the peanuts out of their shells to be used in a salad that you're going to be eating later. That's becoming too similar to extraction or threshing, or any of the forbidden labors that are associated with harvesting and food production and cooking. You can put the elements together of a salad, but you can't be doing a prohibited labor like shucking or drawing a whole bunch of nuts out of a shell. But you can eat a banana. You can peel a banana and eat it. You can crack a nut open and eat the nut. I think. Like I said, I'm not a rabbi. I'm not an expert in this. I wasn't prepared to answer that question, so you should check. All right. Cynthia Lentz. I'm new to this. If the fish jumps onto your boat and you wish to keep it fresh in a container of water, would this be allowed? If the person has a Gentile servant, could the servant do it? Now, remember we were distinguishing in terms of the fish jumping into the boat between a kinyan of acquisition, which could happen at any time, and actually would happen not on Shabbos, right? So when transfers of ownership do not happen on Shabbos. We don't buy, we don't fish, we don't sell, we don't lend, we don't do any kinds of transfers of ownership on Shabbos. So we're distinguishing between the laws of Shabbos and the laws of transfers of ownership that would happen during the week. So, certainly during the week, you could keep the fish fresh. If you're asking me, could you transfer a fish? We didn't cover this in the DAF. Could you take a fish out of a container of water and put it into another container of water? The fish is now in its element. I don't know the answer. I'm thinking this might be like water and water, because the fish belongs in that water. And I think maybe you'd be taking it from its element and putting it into an element. I'm guessing that would be a valid taking or a valid placing, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Joey Takikawa Curry. So if there is an apple tree with branches growing over a wall and above the sidewalk, and the apple is above the designated handbreadths, can I grab the apple? No. If the apple was simply on the wall, yes. But picking it off the tree, why can't you do it? Because that's harvesting. You can't pick an apple on Shabbos, even though it's up in the air. Here the issue isn't that you're taking from one domain to another. Here the issue is that you're harvesting the apple. That I know you cannot do. You can't pick fruit off the vine or pick fruit off a tree or cut a flower and bring it inside and put it in a vase on Shabbos, because that is like reaping. That's the forbidden labor of reaping. Okay, my friends, that is what I've got for us today. Beautiful. Okay. Thank you for joining me on today's journey. We went through quite a bit. If you join late, I don't usually say this at the end of class, but today I'm going to say it. Go back and hear this class, because we covered a lot of kind of inner and important spiritual material that we learned out of some of these physical laws of taking and placing on Shabbos. I highly recommend today's class. My friends, it's been great to be learning with you. I hope that it inspires and elevates you. I was lost when I went to a shir the first time I tried to learn Talmud and was learning from somebody who'd been teaching with people who'd been learning for many years, and all the jargon, it was incomprehensible to me. I'm no expert, but I've learned enough that I have enough confidence now to teach. I'm not the greatest Talmud teacher in the world, but I'm probably the most accessible Talmud teacher in the world. And I hope that you're getting something valuable out of it. Sending you lots of love from LA.